Imagine a powerful judge thinking he's untouchable, only to be brought down in handcuffs, right in his own courtroom, by none other than Pam Bondi. This is a story about courage, justice, and standing up to corruption when no one else dares. The grand federal courtroom in downtown Chicago buzzed with anticipation as people filled the gallery, waiting for what had already been called the trial of the year. Reporters gathered along the back wall, adjusting their cameras and microphones, ready to capture every moment. Pam Bondi, lead prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office, walked in with calm, collected confidence, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The case was enormous, a corporate embezzlement scandal involving Victor Ellison, a powerful CEO with deep political ties accused of funneling millions in public funds into his private ventures. What made this case even more explosive was that rumors swirled about corruption reaching into the court itself, though no one had dared to say it out loud yet. At the bench sat Judge Alan Mercer, an imposing figure known for his stern rulings and sharp tongue. Whispers had long followed Mercer about his suspicious leniency toward the elite, but today, Pam knew she was about to confront something far beyond the usual courtroom sparring. She had come armed with ironclad evidence, and she was ready to take on Ellison's high-priced defense team. Victor Ellison sat smugly at the defense table, adjusting his cufflinks as though this entire trial was just another business negotiation. His attorney, Nathan Cole, one of the city's top corporate lawyers, looked equally at ease, exchanging quiet words with his client as though victory was inevitable. Pam approached her table, carefully laying out her files while her team flanked her, their expressions tense but ready. This wasn't just another high-profile case, it was a battle for justice against two titans of power, a corrupt businessman and possibly a compromised judge. As Mercer banged his gavel to call the court to order, Pam Bondi knew she was walking straight into a fight. But she had come ready to win. The trial began with the usual formalities, but it didn't take long for the tension to rise. As Pam Bondi stood to deliver her opening statement, the entire courtroom seemed to lean in, hanging on her every word. She was calm, precise, and relentless, laying out the government's case. Victor Ellison had embezzled more than $50 million in public infrastructure funds through a complicated network of shell companies, and now it was time to hold him accountable. But before Pam could get halfway through her carefully prepared remarks, Judge Mercer cut her off sharply, leaning forward with an expression that carried more disdain than neutrality. "Ms. Bondi," Mercer interrupted, "I assume you're not here to give us a lecture in accounting. We do have limited time today." The defense table smirked. Nathan Cole glanced sideways at Ellison, who allowed himself a small chuckle, as though they knew the judge was already in their corner. Pam straightened her papers calmly, refusing to take the bait. "With respect, Your Honor, the financials are critical to understanding how these funds were diverted." Mercer waved his hand dismissively. Yes, we've all heard government theories before. Get to the point, Ms. Bondi, this isn't a press conference." The words landed hard, the implied insult, but Pam kept her composure. She was no stranger to powerful men trying to rattle her. "Very well, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "The point is that the evidence will show Mr. Ellison personally approved these transactions, in clear violation of state and federal law." Before she could continue, Mercer leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he were bored. "We'll see if you can make that case without wasting this court's time." Around the room, a subtle shift was happening. Jurors exchanged glances, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and even some of the court staff looked up with thinly veiled surprise. This was beyond tough questioning. This was a judge clearly aligning himself against the prosecution before evidence was even heard. Pam's team exchanged tense glances, but she kept her face unreadable, knowing that the worst thing she could do now was show frustration. Instead, she locked eyes with Mercer, silently signaling that she wasn't going anywhere, and neither was this case. As the trial moved forward, Pam Bondi began presenting her first round of evidence, carefully compiled financial records that detailed how Victor Ellison had siphoned state funds through dummy corporations and fake invoices. She approached the projector with steady hands, displaying a spreadsheet that outlined the transactions line by line, each figure a nail in the coffin. The room leaned forward, jurors studying the numbers, reporters taking rapid notes. Pam pointed toward the screen. If you follow the flow of funds, Your Honor, you'll see that the state's infrastructure budget was drained into Ellison's companies under false pretenses. These were not legitimate expenses but personal transfers masked as construction costs. But before she could explain further, Judge Mercer's voice sliced through the air. "Ms. Bondi," he said sharply, "I don't need a math lesson." Pam paused, glancing over at Mercer, carefully measuring her next words. "With respect, Your Honor, these records are foundational to proving—" Mercer raised a hand, cutting her off. "Enough. I've reviewed the documents. Unless you have something more compelling, I don't see why this should be dragged out. You're testing the court's patience." From the defense table, Nathan Cole leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face, while Ellison kept his gaze fixed on Pam, confidence returning to his features. They knew Mercer was working in their favor, and they wanted Pam to know it too. Pam exhaled slowly, refusing to rise to the provocation. "Your Honor, these documents establish a pattern of fraud that's critical to the case. I respectfully request the court allow me to present them in full." Mercer leaned forward, steepling his fingers, eyes cold. "Denied. This court isn't here to entertain theories. Unless you have direct evidence tying Mr. Ellison to criminal intent, I suggest you move on." A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Jurors shifted in their seats, glancing at each other in confusion. The evidence was damning, and yet here was the judge, refusing to even hear it. From the gallery, a few reporters exchanged glances, realizing this was no ordinary trial. Pam stood firm, her mind racing. She had prepared for resistance, but Mercer's open hostility was worse than she had anticipated. Still, she refused to show weakness. "Very well, Your Honor," she said calmly, though her jaw tightened slightly. "In that case, I'll move to present email correspondence directly implicating Mr. Ellison in authorizing these transfers." But again, Mercer shut her down before she could even get started. "Ms. Bondi, I will not allow this courtroom to become a fishing expedition." Pam's team exchanged glances, knowing they were in a fight for more than just a verdict. They were fighting to be heard in a courtroom where the odds had been stacked against them. But Pam, unfazed, simply looked Mercer in the eye, knowing that her moment was coming. And when it did, she would be ready. As the judge continued to block every piece of evidence Pam Bondi presented, it became clear to everyone in that room what was happening. Judge Mercer wasn't just biased, he was protecting Victor Ellison. Yet Pam remained remarkably composed, her posture straight, her voice unwavering. She knew showing anger would only play into Mercer's hands, so she took a slow breath and adjusted her papers, allowing a moment of tension to build. "Your Honor," Pam began smoothly, "if you would allow me to proceed, I believe the court would benefit from understanding how these financial records tied directly to Mr. Ellison's personal accounts." Mercer raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Mercer Bondi, I think we've entertained enough of your theories for one day. Unless you have something truly concrete, I suggest you sit down and reconsider your approach." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the jurors who had been dutifully watching began to exchange concerned glances. Reporters paused mid-sentence in their notebooks, sensing a storm brewing. But instead of bristling at the judge's dismissiveness, Pam paused, turned to fully face Mercer, and let a small, deliberate smile curl on her lips, a smile that said she knew exactly what was happening. "Your Honor," she said in a calm but firm voice, "with all due respect, it is not the role of this court to preemptively dismiss evidence before it has been properly reviewed by the jury." Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, but Pam continued, her tone sharpening just enough to convey that she wasn't there to play games. "And while I understand you may have concerns about the scope of this evidence, if there are professional issues interfering with the impartial handling of this case, I'm more than willing to request a recess so those concerns can be addressed formally." The meaning behind her words was crystal clear to everyone in the room. She was implying, without outright saying, that Mercer's conduct was questionable, and she was ready to challenge it in front of higher authorities. For the first time since the trial began, Mercer visibly stiffened, the arrogant smirk momentarily faltering as he leaned forward, placing both hands on the bench. "I don't think you want to push this, Ms. Bondi," he said quietly, almost in warning. Pam tilted her head slightly, her expression serene but her eyes sharp as steel. "On the contrary, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, "I'm prepared to push as far as necessary to ensure justice is served." A murmur rippled through the gallery as Mercer sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the wood slowly. Pam returned to her table, her quiet defiance leaving the entire room with the sense that something had just shifted. That Pam Bondi was not someone who would back down, no matter how high the stakes. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as Pam Bondi rose from her chair, adjusting her blazer with deliberate calm. Everyone knew something was coming. She clicked to display a city contract between Victor Ellison's company and the city's planning board, a $3 million project on paper. Facing the jury, her voice steady and commanding, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this document lists the official expenses, but what I'm about to show you tells a very different story." With another click, an internal ledger appeared, revealing payouts nearly double the official amount. Funds funneled quietly to hidden accounts. Jurors leaned in, eyes narrowing. Ellison tensed, his confident mask beginning to slip. Before Pam could continue, Judge Mercer's sharp voice cut through the room. "Ms. Bondi, unless you have a sworn statement or direct proof tying Mr. Ellison to these transactions, I don't see how this is anything more than speculation." Pam turned toward him, calm but unwavering. "Funny you should say that, Your Honor," she replied, walking back to her table. From her briefcase, she pulled out a folder stamped sealed evidence, holding it high for all to see. "Because I do." The room stirred. Mercer's smirk faltered. "Explain yourself," he demanded, though his voice now lacked its usual confidence. Pam opened the folder, removing a printed email thread bearing Ellison's name, approving unauthorized transfers and copying unknown individuals. "These emails," she said, now projecting them on screen, "were subpoenaed from Ellison's own company. You'll see he directly authorizes these payments." Silence followed, broken only by reporters furiously scribbling notes. But Pam wasn't finished. She reached into her bag again and placed a small audio recorder on the table. "This," she said, locking eyes with Mercer, "is a lawfully obtained recording I think the jury should hear." Mercer shifted uneasily, the first visible crack in his armor. "Ms. Bondi, I hope you're not about to present anything inappropriate," he warned, though his voice lacked its usual edge. Pam simply smiled and pressed play. The room filled with Mercer's own voice, sharp and deliberate. "Make sure she never sees those ledgers, you understand me? If she gets her hands on that, we're all done." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Jurors froze in shock. Reporters clutched pens and phones, stunned. Even Officer Daniels, the bailiff, turned sharply toward the bench, wide-eyed. Pam let the recording play to the end before allowing the silence to stretch. She wanted everyone to feel the weight of what they had just heard. Finally, she turned to Mercer, her voice calm but cutting. "Your Honor, care to explain?" Mercer's face had gone pale. "That recording," he stammered, but Pam cut him off, "was obtained under warrant," she said coldly, "and confirmed by a monitored investigation." Nathan Cole, Ellison's attorney, looked panicked, stealing glances at his now visibly shaken client. Pam wasn't finished. She placed a transcript of the recording and a supporting wiretap conversation onto the evidence table. "Here are the documents verifying what you just heard, along with corroborating communications from Mr. Ellison himself." Turning back to the jury, she let her words hang in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not speculation. This is not theory. This is a sitting judge colluding to obstruct justice." The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Mercer sat frozen, fists clenched on the bench. After a long pause, his voice cracked as he barked, "I'm ruling this evidence inadmissible." Pam tilted her head slightly, her voice like ice. "With all due respect, Your Honor, given that you are now implicated in this crime, I don't believe you have the authority to make that call." Turning to Officer Daniels, she gave a calm but firm nod. "Officer, I believe it's time we proceed." Daniels hesitated for a beat, glancing between Mercer and Pam, then squared his shoulders and reached for his radio. Pam's voice, now addressing the entire courtroom, rang clear. "And for the record, this court and this trial are far from over." At that moment, everyone realized the truth had just shattered the walls Mercer had built, and Pam Bondi had done it without flinching. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Officer Daniels stepped forward, hand resting firmly on his radio. At the bench, Judge Mercer sat frozen, his sharp eyes now wide with disbelief, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Across from him, Pam Bondi stood calm and composed, arms crossed as her gaze met Mercer's, daring him to speak. The jurors were visibly rattled, some leaning in to hear what would happen, others whispering anxiously. Finally, Officer Daniels broke the silence, his voice steady and firm. "Judge Mercer, under the authority granted to me by federal warrant, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." A wave of gasps and whispers tore through the courtroom as Daniels stepped closer, pulling out a set of handcuffs. Mercer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The man who had commanded this courtroom for years was now powerless. "You can't do this," Mercer finally said, though his voice was weak, stripped of authority. "I am the law in this courtroom." Pam shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "Not anymore." Daniels moved beside the bench. "Sir, I need you to stand," he said, keeping his voice respectful but unwavering. Mercer flinched and pulled his arm away. "Do you know who I am?" he snapped, his face turning red. "I've served this court for 20 years. You're destroying everything." Daniels stood firm. "Sir, please stand. Don't make this harder than it has to be." For a long, painful moment, Mercer stayed seated, like a man hoping the world would stop turning. But as reality settled on his shoulders, he slumped slightly and rose to his feet, moving slowly, as though stalling would save him. As the handcuffs clicked shut, a murmur rippled through the room. The sound echoing like a gunshot. The once feared Judge Mercer was now shackled in front of everyone, stripped of all power. Okeru, Danae, and Bill left a simple tent and opened up advertising in Portland, and a society whose stance crumbled at a desperate level, at a crossroad. Danae and Bill had just crumbled. Mercer turned to Pam, his glare sharp and desperate. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You think this ends here? It doesn't." Pam stepped closer, her voice low but clear. "I'm not worried about where it ends," she said. "I'm focused on where justice starts. And that starts today." Daniels gently guided Mercer toward the door, but Mercer dug his heels in, trying for one last stand. "This is political," he snapped. "You're making a mistake." Pam turned to the gallery, now filled with reporters furiously typing and whispering. "No, Judge Mercer," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "The only mistake was thinking you could betray the public trust and never answer for it." The room fell silent again, every eye locked on Mercer and Pam. A man who had passed judgment on others now stood judged himself, and everyone knew they were witnessing history. As Mercer was led away, the click of cameras filled the air. Reporters whispered as they typed, knowing this story would dominate the headlines by morning. Pam walked back to her table, adjusting her files like she would on any other day, but this was no ordinary day. The power in the room had shifted completely. Jurors who had been wary before now looked at her with newfound respect. Ellison sat pale and tight-lipped, his hands clasped on the table, while Cole leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear. They both knew the tides had turned, and Mercer's downfall meant Ellison no longer had protection. Pam leaned toward her team, her voice calm but resolute. "It's not over," she said, her eyes locked on Ellison, "not by a long shot." One of her assistants leaned in. "What now?" Pam's gaze never wavered. "Now we see if Ellison wants to keep fighting or if he's ready to talk." On the bench, Mercer's gavel sat abandoned, a silent reminder that power, when abused, always falls. The tension in the courtroom was thick, but the power had clearly shifted. As Judge Mercer was led away in handcuffs, Victor Ellison sat frozen, his once smug expression now overtaken by dread. His attorney Nathan Cole leaned in, whispering frantically, but the panic in Ellison's eyes betrayed him. Whatever confidence they had when they walked in was shattered the moment Mercer's conspiracy was exposed on that recording. At her table, Pam Bondi sat calm and composed, adjusting her files with precision. The jurors watched her now with newfound respect, a few giving small nods, silently acknowledging the truth laid bare. Across the room, reporters scribbled furiously, their eyes darting between Pam and Ellison, knowing this was the moment that would define the case. Cole finally rose, clearing his throat, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Your Honor," he began, only to falter, realizing there was no longer a judge presiding. He looked helplessly from Pam to the court. "Given recent events, the defense requests a brief recess to confer with our client." Pam stood, poised and steady. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, nodding to the empty bench, a comment that drew soft chuckles from the gallery. She turned to address the court directly. "The jury deserves to see how deep this corruption runs. A recess now only gives Mr. Ellison and his counsel time to regroup after what we've just exposed." Cole looked like he might argue, but Ellison's panicked glance at him stopped him cold. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp and clear, unless, of course, the defense is ready to enter serious plea negotiations. Silence filled the room. Ellison looked down, defeated, and finally gave a faint nod to Cole, a silent admission that the fight was over. Pam saw it, and she knew. The walls around Ellison were collapsing, and she was ready to bring the whole house down. Judge Mercer's arrest and Pam Bondi's takedown of Victor Ellison sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom. By the time the hearing ended, the media exploded, with headlines like, "Federal Judge Arrested in Courtroom Corruption Scandal," and "Ellison Case Implodes as Bondi Exposes Judicial Conspiracy." Reporters gathered outside for live updates, while news panels rushed to analyze the stunning turn of events. Though public confidence in the system had been shaken, Pam's courage sent a clear message. Corruption would be confronted no matter how powerful the players. Inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, Pam was met with a new level of respect, even from colleagues who had doubted her decision to go after such high-profile figures. Those who had been skeptical now recognized what her relentless persistence had accomplished. Behind the scenes, federal investigators launched a wider probe into Mercer's rulings and Ellison's political connections, with subpoenas flying out to uncover just how far their corruption had spread. Meanwhile, Victor Ellison, realizing his fall was inevitable, quickly entered plea negotiations, offering cooperation in exchange for leniency, an outcome Pam had foreseen when she refused to back down. As Pam walked out of the courthouse into the cool Chicago afternoon, she paused on the steps, watching as cameras flashed and reporters swarmed to capture the historic moment. But beyond the chaos, Pam felt something deeper. A sense of justice finally served. Taking down Mercer and Ellison hadn't been easy, but it was why she had chosen this fight, to hold the powerful accountable. Still, as she took a deep breath, Pam knew this wasn't the end. If Mercer and Ellison could manipulate the system so boldly, who else was hiding in the shadows? Yet today, for everyone watching, the public, the jurors, her team, justice had won, and Pam was ready for whatever battle came next. The story of Pam Bondi facing down corruption in the courtroom teaches a powerful lesson about courage, integrity, and accountability. Even when faced with a corrupt judge and a powerful defendant, Pam never backed down. She showed that true justice requires standing firm, even when the odds in the system seem stacked against you. Her calm, strategic approach reminds us that strength isn't about who speaks the loudest, but who holds firm to the truth. Pam's willingness to confront Judge Mercer publicly and expose the hidden corruption also highlights the importance of transparency and vigilance in positions of power. No matter how high someone's title, no one is above the law, and those who betray public trust must be held accountable. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that real leadership means doing what's right, even when it's difficult, unpopular, or dangerous. Pam's refusal to be intimidated, her sharp focus on the facts, and her ability to stay composed under pressure show that one person's courage can bring down an entire web of corruption. It's a lesson that justice, though often hard-won, will always prevail when we have the courage to fight for it.